The night was a shroud, so thick and moonless you could taste the darkness in the Mississippi woods. The only light was a single, steady flame from a brass lantern held by a rider on a dark horse. The rider, Josiah Green, was a silhouette against his own small glow, his face obscured by the wide brim of a worn hat. From his vantage point on the ridge, he watched a gathering of white-robed figures below, their forms flickering like malevolent ghosts around a bonfire. Their voices were a low, menacing murmur carried on the humid air, the words indistinct, but the hatred unmistakable. Josiah's gloved hand rested on the cool, familiar stock of the Sharp's rifle laid across his saddle. He was not just a man watching evil unfold. He was a reckoning in waiting, a promise whispered in the dark, but he didn't know that his hunt for justice would lead him to uncover a conspiracy that reached the highest echelons of Natchez society, forcing him to confront the very men who once called him a friend. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. A few weeks earlier, same man had arrived in Natchez with a different purpose. The war was over, a brutal, bloody chapter closed, and Josiah Green, a freedman, a former Union scout, had come home seeking the quiet life he'd earned. He stood on the deck of the riverboat as it churned toward the landing, the paddle wheels slapping a rhythm against the muddy water. The air that washed over him was a sensory overload, a thick, humid blanket smelling of sweet magnolias and the faint, underlying scent of decay, a perfume he knew all too well. The familiar sounds of the town, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the calls of vendors, the lowing of cattle, were all there, but they were now overlaid with a new, palpable tension. It was in the way men looked at each other, the guarded quiet that fell when he, a black man in worn but sturdy clothes, walked past a group of white planters. He saw the changes wrought by war and Reconstruction, the hopeful, determined faces of fellow freedmen building new lives. But he also saw the old, familiar lines of power reasserting themselves like weeds choking a garden. His own face was a testament to the miles he'd traveled and the horrors he'd witnessed, weathered by sun and worry, his eyes holding the deep, quiet weight of a man who had seen the worst of humanity. He carried a single worn leather satchel containing all his worldly possessions, his shoulders straight, his posture that of a soldier who could never truly be at ease. He walked through the freedmen's district, a part of town bustling with a fragile energy. Here, the air was thick with the smell of frying fish and sawdust from new construction. He found the small, whitewashed church, its steeple reaching for the sky like a prayer. Next to it stood the general store, its porch crowded with barrels and its windows promising staples and small comforts. This was the domain of his childhood friend, Elias, now a preacher, and Elias's sister, Sarah. The reunion was a collision of warmth and sorrow. Elias, his face fuller than Josiah remembered, his hands softened by books rather than tools, embraced him with a cry of disbelief. Josiah, by the grace of God, you're alive. The hug was strong, a desperate affirmation of survival in a world that had tried to grind them all to dust. Josiah returned it, a rare, small smile touching his lips. The Lord saw fit to spare me, he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest. I came home looking for peace, Elias. Just a small piece of it. He looked past his friend to Sarah, who stood in the doorway of the store. Her arms crossed, her expression was grim, her eyes holding a weary wisdom that made her seem older than her years. "Peace is in short supply in Natchez these days, Josiah," she said, her voice devoid of the joyful surprise that had animated her brother. "The night riders, they own the darkness now." Over the next hour, sitting in the small, sparse room behind the store that served as Elias's office, the grim reality of this new Natchez unfolded. The Ku Klux Klan, a name whispered with a mixture of terror and fury, was not a distant threat but a suffocating presence. Elias spoke of their methods with a pained, righteous anger, his preacher's voice rising and falling with the cadence of a sermon. He spoke of homes burned to the ground in the dead of night, of families threatened into silence, their crops destroyed, their livestock stolen. He spoke of good people, hard-working people, buried with no justice, their deaths dismissed by a sheriff who was either complicit or powerless. Sarah, more practical and direct, filled in the brutal details. She spoke of the Carter family, whose small farm out on the North Road had been burned to the ground just last week. Their crime, their cotton yield had been better than their white neighbors. A man known for his sour disposition and heavy drinking. They didn't just burn the fields, Josiah, Sarah said, her voice tight with suppressed rage. They burned the house, with the family inside, the parents. They got the children out, but they lost everything, everything they had built since the Jubilee. Josiah listened, his face a mask of stone. The hope for peace he had carried all the way from the battlefields of Virginia felt like a fragile, foolish thing. He had seen war. But this was different. This was a sickness, a cowardly poison that attacked not soldiers, but families in their sleep. A cold, familiar purpose began to stir in his gut. He had to see it for himself. The next morning, he rode out from town on a borrowed mule, the sun already beating down with a relentless heat. He didn't need directions. The pillar of smoke, though faint now, had been a smudge on the horizon for days. As he got closer, the smell hit him first. The acrid, lingering stench of ash, ruin, and scorched earth. The scene that greeted him was one of utter devastation. The frame of the small farmhouse was a blackened skeleton clawing at the bright blue sky. The fields, once a source of pride and promise, were a charred wasteland. Josiah dismounted and walked through the debris, his scout's eyes missing nothing. He saw the deep hoofprints of shod horses, more than a dozen, their pattern chaotic and cruel. He saw the discarded stubs of torches, the splintered remains of a door kicked in with violent force. He moved through what was once a home, his boots crunching on charred wood and shattered pottery. He imagined the family's terror, the heat, the smoke, the screams swallowed by the vast, indifferent night. Near where the children's room would have been, a small splash of color caught his eye. He knelt, his knees cracking, and brushed away the soot and dirt. It was a small rag doll, its yarn hair scorched, its button eyes staring up at him with a vacant, heartbreaking innocence. He picked it up, the rough, burnt fabric coarse against his calloused fingers. His knuckles turned white as he clenched his fist around the small toy. In that moment, something inside him shifted. The faint, flickering hope for a peaceful life, for a quiet plot of land and the solace of forgetting, was extinguished completely. It was replaced by a cold, familiar rage, an emotion he had honed to a razor's edge during the war. That rage did not scream. It solidified into a chilling, silent purpose. He was no longer just Josiah Green, the farmer who was, or the scout he had been. He was becoming something else entirely, something the Night Riders had created. The transition was not marked by a flurry of anger, but by the meticulous, quiet efficiency of a predator preparing for the hunt. He returned the mule and used the last of his army pay to acquire a strong, dark horse, a gelding with intelligent eyes, and the ability to move through the dense woods as silently as a shadow. He spent an entire afternoon in a secluded glade by the river, meticulously cleaning his old Sharps rifle from the war. He disassembled it with practiced ease, oiling each part, feeling the satisfying click as he put it back together. This was not just a weapon, it was an extension of his will. He found a sturdy brass lantern in a dusty corner of Sarah's store, its glass miraculously intact. He polished the brass until it gleamed and bought a piece of white chalk, its purpose known only to him. He spent his days observing, not resting. He rode the back roads, his face shaded by his hat, appearing to be just another freedman looking for work. But he was mapping the county in his mind, noting the clan's preferred routes, the isolated farms, the secret meeting spots in the deep woods. He learned their habits, identifying members from a distance by the way they rode, the quality of their horses, the arrogant tilt of their heads. He spent his nights watching, a shadow that learned the other shadow's ways. He became a creature of the twilight and the dawn, his senses sharpened, his body hardened. The man who had come to Natchez seeking peace was gone, and in his place stood the hunter. The first target was a man named Silas Croft, a former overseer whose cruelty had been a legend on the plantation where Josiah was born. Croft had taken to the clan's white robe with the zeal of a convert. He wore his power not like a hood, but like a second skin, his arrogance sharpened by the impunity the robe provided. On a night thick with the chorus of cicadas, Croft led a raid on the small cabin of a freedman cooper who had dared to underbid him on a contract for barrel staves. The raid was a storm of drunken noise and terror. They circled the cabin on horseback, torches held high, their shouts a litany of slurs and threats that echoed through the pines. Croft, his voice a rasping bellow, was the conductor of this symphony of fear. He dismounted, kicked in the flimsy door, and reveled in the screams of the cooper's wife and children as he overturned their meager furniture. After an hour of torment, having smashed the man's tools and set fire to his stack of seasoned wood, the clansman rode off, laughing and boasting into the darkness. Croft, his belly full of cheap whiskey and his soul bloated with hate, broke off from the main group. His path home was a familiar one, a lonely trail that cut through a dense stretch of woods. He rode with a loose rein, humming a tuneless, ugly song, utterly secure in his place in the world. He never saw the rope, stretched taut between two ancient oaks at the height of a rider's chest. It was nearly invisible in the gloom. Josiah, hidden in a thicket of wild cane, had been waiting for over an hour, as still and patient as the trees themselves. As Croft's horse passed under the rope, the taut line caught him squarely across his collarbones. The impact was brutal, a solid, unyielding force that lifted him clean out of the saddle. He was airborne for a split second, a stunned grunt of surprise escaping his lips before he crashed to the ground, the air driven from his lungs in a painful whoosh. Before the first flicker of coherent thought could return, before he could even think to cry out, a shadow fell over him, a boot pressed firmly on his chest, and a gloved hand, smelling of leather and earth, clamped over his mouth. Croft's eyes, wide with shock and sudden sobriety, stared up into the featureless dark hollow beneath the brim of a wide hat. There was no sound but his own panicked, muffled breathing and the gentle rustle of leaves as his horse, spooked by the sudden violence, trotted a few yards away before stopping to graze. The efficiency was terrifying. A gag was forced between his teeth and tied tight. His hands were bound behind his back with a speed and precision that spoke of long practice. There was no struggle, no fight. It was like being handled by a force of nature. Silas Croft, the feared enforcer, the man whose whip had broken backs and spirits, was disarmed, gagged, and helpless in less than a minute. Josiah hoisted the heavy, sputtering man over his own horse's saddle, securing him like a sack of grain. He then caught the reins of Croft's wandering mount, leading it a quarter-mile in the opposite direction before giving it a sharp slap on the rump, sending it trotting back towards town. Then, without a backward glance, he melted back into the trees, the brass lantern on his saddle casting a single steady beam that cut a path through the absolute darkness. The next morning, the community was a hive of whispers. Silas Croft's horse had been found wandering near the edge of town, its saddle empty. Of the man himself, there was no sign. The sheriff made a cursory search, but Croft had many enemies, and the general assumption was that he had finally picked a fight with the wrong man in a drunken stupor and ended up in a ditch. But then, a different story began to circulate. The Cooper's family, emerging from their terrorized night, found something new outside their broken home. On the ancient, gnarled oak tree that shaded their yard, a place where their children played, was a stark white chalk mark. It was a simple X, drawn with a firm, deliberate hand. It hadn't been there the day before. In Sarah's general store, the whispers took on a new texture. Fear of the clan was still the dominant note, but it was now tinged with a strange, dangerous harmony of hope. They say a spirit took him. An old man with skin like wrinkled parchment confided to his neighbor, his voice a low, awed murmur. A horseman who rides with the moon, a spirit of vengeance for our people. A young woman, her baby sleeping soundly on her back, chimed in, her eyes wide. My boy saw the mark on the Carter's tree too, after the fire. He said it wasn't there before. He said it looked like a promise. The legend of the hunter of Natchez was born in those hushed conversations, a phantom conjured from the community's desperate need for a protector. Sarah and Elias heard it all, their faces carefully neutral as they measured out flour and counted pennies. Later that day, when Josiah came in for a length of rope and a sack of oats, they shared the stories with him, their eyes searching his impassive face for any flicker of recognition, any sign that he was the source of these wild, hopeful rumors. He simply listened, his expression as unreadable as a stone. He nodded, paid for his goods, and left, leaving them with nothing but his silence and their growing, unnerving suspicion. Josiah's methods were a science of patience and observation. He spent the next 2 nights tracking a larger group of clansmen, a dozen riders strong. He moved through the forest like a ghost, a shadow flitting between other shadows, His knowledge of the terrain, honed during years of scouting for the Union Army, made him all but invisible. He knew how to use the contours of the land, how to step on dry leaves without a crunch, how to read the direction of the wind to keep his scent from the horses. He was an extension of the wilderness, and in it, he was king. He didn't attack the group. A direct confrontation was a fool's errand. Instead, he waited, observing their patrol patterns, their crude command structure, their individual habits. He was a predator studying the herd, looking for the one who would stray from the safety of the pack. He found his target in a young, nervous man named Caleb. Caleb was barely a man at all, a boy with frightened eyes, and a borrowed horse that he rode with a clumsy uncertainty. He was clearly new to the clan, eager to please, but terrified of the violence he was participating in. Josiah watched as the group's leader, a burly man with a voice like gravel, sent Caleb on an errand to deliver a message to a nearby farm. The boy rode off, relieved to be away from the main group's menacing energy, unaware that he was being watched. Josiah let him get a mile away before he made his move. He didn't ride up on him, he simply materialized. One moment, Caleb was riding through a silent grove of pines. The next, a dark figure was standing in the middle of the path, the brass lantern held aloft, its light making the shadows leap and dance. Caleb pulled his horse to a skidding halt, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Your white robe won't save you," a voice said, a low growl that seemed to come from the very shadows themselves. Caleb stammered, his hand trembling as it went for the pistol tucked in his belt. Who are you?" The figure took a step forward and the lantern light caught the cold, hard steel of a rifle barrel. "I'm the man who asks the questions. Who is your leader?" Caleb's bravado crumbled into dust. I don't know. I swear," he whimpered, his voice cracking. Josiah took another step, his presence overwhelming, an aura of absolute menace that needed no shouted threats. "You know his name." Caleb began to sob, tears tracing clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. "It's Beaumont, Mr. August Beaumont. He owns the big plantation south of the river. Please, I just do what I'm told." Josiah nodded slowly. He took Caleb to a place deep in the woods, a place that didn't exist on any map. He pulled aside a heavy curtain of kudzu vine to reveal a set of old stone steps leading down into the earth. It was a hidden root cellar, forgotten for decades. The air inside was cool and damp, smelling of rich soil and fear. In the far corner, bound and silent, his eyes wide with terror in the lantern light, was Silas Croft. Caleb gasped, a fresh wave of horror washing over him. Josiah wasn't a killer. He was a jailer. He was collecting the clan, one by one, and locking them away in the dark heart of the earth. The disappearances sent a tremor of fear through the clan's ranks. August Beaumont, a man whose wealth and lineage had insulated him from consequence his entire life, was furious. He sat in the leather-bound luxury of his study, the air smelling of bourbon and cigar smoke, and glared at the half-dozen nervous men standing before him. The mood was not triumphant, as it usually was after their secret meetings, but fearful. Two men. Beaumont slammed his fist on the polished mahogany of his desk, the sound making his men jump, vanished into thin air. "Are you telling me that a dozen of you were out there and you saw nothing, heard nothing?" A grizzled farmer, his face pale under his sunburn, shifted his weight nervously. "It's like the devil himself is out there, sir. The folks, the coloreds, they're calling him the hunter. They say he's a spirit." Beaumont let out a snort of derisive laughter, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. His authority, which he considered as natural and unassailable as the sunrise, was being challenged not by the law, not by the federal government, but by a phantom, a superstition. It was unnerving. "Superstition is for the simple-minded and the weak," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous whip-crack. "This is a man. One man. And you are letting him make fools of you." The way they glanced at the dark windows as if expecting a face to appear. And he knew that his hold over them was slipping, being eroded by this ghost story. He had to reassert control. From now on, no one rides alone. No one. You ride in groups of no less than 10. And you don't just carry those pistols for show. If a shadow moves, you shoot it. If a leaf falls too loudly, you shoot it. I want this hunter found, and I want him brought to me. Is that understood?" The men nodded, their relief at having a clear order palpable. But even as they left the opulent study and stepped back into the night, they clutched their weapons a little tighter, their eyes scanning the darkness, no longer masters of it, but trespassers in a land that now belonged to a hunter. Josiah knew Beaumont's order had changed the landscape of the hunt. The clan no longer rode in small, arrogant clusters. They moved as a single, cumbersome beast, a dozen riders bunched together, their fear making them clumsy and loud. They were a less effective tool of terror this way, but a much harder target for a lone hunter. Picking one off from the herd was now impossible without revealing his position and inviting a hail of panicked gunfire. He needed a new strategy, one that would turn their numbers against them. He found his opportunity on a windy night, the dry leaves skittering across the ground like frantic whispers. The clan was patrolling the perimeter of a series of small farms owned by freedmen, a show of force meant to intimidate and remind everyone who still held the power. Josiah watched them from a ridge, a plan forming in the cold, calculating part of his mind. He circled around them, his horse moving with a ghostly silence, and made his way to a long disused fence line a half-mile to the east. The wood was old and dry, perfect tinder. He didn't need a roaring inferno, just enough of a blaze to create alarm. He lit a small bundle of dried grass and pine needles and tossed it into the heart of a thick tangle of overgrown brush clinging to the fence. The wind did the rest. The fire caught with a hungry whoosh, flames climbing the old dry posts and spreading along the fence line with surprising speed. It cast a lurid, dancing orange glow against the night sky, a beacon of alarm. From his new position, Josiah watched the clansmen react. There were shouts of confusion, then orders barked by their leader. A fire, especially an unexpected one, was a primal fear. It could threaten homes, trap livestock, spread to the forest. Leaving it unchecked was not an option. The main group, 10 riders strong, wheeled their horses around and galloped toward the blaze, their white robes looking like panicked moths drawn to a deadly flame. They left 2 men behind. It was a standard precaution, guarding their meeting spot and their rear. But tonight, it was a fatal mistake. The 2 guards, left alone in the sudden quiet, were visibly nervous. They dismounted, their eyes scanning the darkness that seemed to have grown deeper now that the main group's torches were gone. Josiah gave them 10 minutes to let the solitude work on them, to let the chirping of the crickets sound like footsteps, and the rustle of the wind in the leaves sound like a threat. He had chosen this spot carefully, a shallow, wooded ravine cut across the trail just ahead of them. Days earlier, he had prepared it, weaving thick vines into cunningly disguised snares, anchoring them to heavy, bent saplings. He moved to the edge of the ravine, a silent predator in the gloom. He picked up a stone and tossed it into the brush on the far side of the trail. The sound was sharp, a distinct crack of a breaking branch. "What was that?" one of the guards whispered, his hand flying to his pistol. "Probably just a deer," the other replied, his voice lacking conviction. "Go check it out. I'll cover you." The first man, eager to prove his courage, stepped off the trail and into the deeper shadows. He took 3 steps before his foot snagged in a loop of vine. The bent sapling, released from its tension, sprang upright with a violent whip, snatching the man off his feet and hoisting him upside down, 10 feet in the air. He let out a single choked cry of shock before he was left swinging, disoriented and helpless. The second guard spun around, his pistol drawn, his eyes wide with terror. "Billy? What in God's name?" He saw his companion dangling like a slaughtered hog, and in that moment of stunned disbelief, Josiah struck. He moved from the darkness of the ravine not like a man, but like a pounce. He hit the guard low and hard, driving a shoulder into his midsection. The man's breath exploded from his lungs, his pistol flying from his grasp as he was driven to the ground. Before he could recover, he was gagged, bound, and dragged into the ravine. A minute later, Josiah climbed the tree where the first guard was still swinging, a knife held between his teeth. He cut the man down, letting him fall into a heap, and had him bound before his head had even stopped spinning. The entire encounter had taken less than 5 minutes. Not a single shot had been fired. The next morning, as the sun burned the mist off the fields, 2 more stark white chalk marks appeared on trees in the community, silent testimonies to the hunter's work. The legend grew, and the fear in the clan's ranks deepened into outright paranoia. The pressure on Sheriff Jones was becoming untenable. He was a pragmatic man, a man who understood the delicate balance of power in Natchez. His position was owed to August Beaumont, a fact Beaumont never let him forget. But 4 missing men, now 6, was no longer a matter he could dismiss as local squabbles or drunken misadventures. Prominent citizens, even if they were night-riding thugs, couldn't simply vanish without a formal investigation. With a heavy sigh, he saddled his horse and rode out to Beaumont's sprawling plantation, a place of unnerving, pristine beauty built on generations of misery. He found Beaumont on the veranda, sipping coffee from a porcelain cup, looking every bit the gentleman planter. The contrast between the sheriff's dusty, sweat-stained uniform and Beaumont's crisp linen suit was a perfect illustration of their relationship. "August," Jones began, foregoing any pleasantries as he removed his hat. "I can't ignore this anymore. 6 men from your, social club are missing. People are talking. The whispers are getting louder than I can control." Beaumont placed his cup down with a deliberate, soft click. He looked at the sheriff, not as an officer of the law, but as a disappointing employee. "Find who's responsible, Sheriff. he said, his voice dangerously calm. "It's some northern agitator, I'm sure of it, stirring up trouble, turning the simple folk against their betters. That is your job, is it not, to handle such unpleasantries?" "I'm doing my job, August," Jones said, his tone defensive. "But I have nothing to go on. No bodies, no witnesses, just chalk marks on trees and ghost stories." Beaumont stood up and walked to the edge of the veranda, staring out at his vast, orderly fields. "Then you are not looking hard enough. Do your duty. Ask your questions. Be seen to be doing your job. And put an end to these ridiculous stories." The command was clear. The sheriff's investigation was to be a performance, a piece of public theater meant to placate the nervous and show that the law was in control. Jones spent the rest of the day doing just that. He rode into town and asked a few clumsy questions at the saloon, his inquiries carefully aimed at men he knew would have nothing to say. He conspicuously avoided the freedman's district, the one place where the ghost stories were being told with the most conviction. From the shadows of a livery stable, Josiah watched the sheriff's charade. He saw the way the lawman's eyes slid away from the faces of black men, the way he spoke only to those who would confirm his own feigned ignorance. It was a bitter confirmation of what he already knew in his bones. The law in Natchez was a shield for men like Beaumont, not a sword for men like him. He was utterly, completely alone in this fight. That evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, Josiah rode to the cabin of the Washingtons, a family who had found a dead chicken with its throat cut on their porch a week prior, a clear Klan warning. He dismounted in a grove of trees, the chalk cool and smooth in his hand. He moved to the large oak that stood sentinel by the family's small vegetable garden and drew the now familiar X. It was a symbol of his presence, a counter-warning. It said, "You are not alone. You are protected." He had just finished, the white mark stark against the dark bark, when a soft sound made him freeze. He turned, his body instantly coiled, his hand dropping to the hilt of the knife at his belt. A small girl was standing not 10 feet away, her bare feet silent on the soft earth. It was the carter's daughter, the one whose family had lost everything in the fire. She was staying with the Washingtons, her aunt and uncle. She wasn't afraid. Her large, dark eyes looked from Josiah's shadowed face, hidden beneath the brim of his hat, to the fresh chalk mark on the tree, and then back to him. She held the scorched, one-eyed rag doll he had found in the ashes of her home, clutching it to her chest like a shield. For a long, silent moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The only sounds were the distant call of a whippoorwill and the soft thumping of Josiah's own heart. The girl didn't speak. She simply raised her free hand, pointed a small finger at the chalk mark, and then gave a small, solemn nod. It was a gesture of profound, silent acknowledgement. It was not the gratitude of a victim being saved, but the understanding of an ally. In her eyes, he saw not fear of the dark man in front of her, but recognition of the hunter she had heard whispered about in hushed, hopeful tones. For the first time in weeks, the cold, crushing weight of his violent mission was lifted, replaced by a powerful, aching warmth. This single silent gesture of trust from an innocent child was more fortifying than any meal, more potent than any weapon. It strengthened his resolve, but it also reminded him with a painful clarity of the innocent lives that were at stake. He was not just a purveyor of vengeance, he was a guardian of hope. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod in return, then turned and melted back into the shadows. The image of the girl and her doll burned into his mind. The root cellar was a tomb of damp air and rising fear. Josiah had separated his captives. Silas Croft and the two guards from the ravine were in one corner, their defiance having long since curdled into a sullen, hateful silence. In the other corner, alone, was Caleb. The boy was broken, days in the near-total darkness, with only the taste of stale water and the sound of his own terrified breathing for company, had stripped away every layer of his bravado. Josiah's interrogations were not exercises in torture. He never laid a hand on them. His method was far more insidious. He used the quiet. He would sit with Caleb in the suffocating darkness for an hour at a time, saying nothing, his presence a massive, silent weight in the small space. Then his voice would come out of the blackness, low and relentless, asking the same questions over and over. The raids aren't random, Caleb. You burn the Carter place. You threaten the Washingtons. You smash the Cooper's tools. Why them? What do they have that Beaumont wants? At first, Caleb had clung to his ignorance, repeating his story about just following orders. But Josiah's quiet, relentless pressure was like water dripping on a stone. He didn't threaten Caleb with pain. He threatened him with an eternity of this, an endless, silent darkness, alone with the ghosts of his own actions. Tell me the truth, boy, Josiah's voice rumbled one night, after a particularly long silence. And you can see the sun again. Lie to me, and you will stay here in the dark until you are nothing but roots and dust. That was what finally broke him. The promise of sunlight. Caleb began to sob. Great, heaving, body-racking sobs of a terrified child. It's the land, he choked out, the words tumbling over each other in a desperate, pathetic rush. It's all about the land. Beaumont, he says their plots are needed. For the new railroad spur, the one coming down from Vicksburg. Josiah remained silent, letting the boy's confession fill the void. He has papers, Caleb continued, his voice a high-pitched whimper. Legal papers, he calls them. Says if the freedmen abandon their land, if they get scared and run, the deeds revert to the county, and he has an arrangement. The land becomes his, for pennies. He said we weren't just purifying the county. He said we were securing its future, his future. In that moment, in the cold, damp darkness of the root cellar, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. A horrifying, ugly clarity washed over Josiah. This wasn't just about the blind, stupid hatred he had known his whole life. This was worse. This was a calculated, greedy, and systematic campaign of terror orchestrated for profit. The Klan wasn't just a mob of angry farmers. It was a weapon, a tool being wielded by a wealthy, powerful man to steal the very future his people had been promised, the 40 acres and a mule of their dreams. The fight was no longer just about stopping a few night riders. It was about dismantling a corrupt and murderous conspiracy. The hunt had just become infinitely more dangerous. Auguste Beaumont's grand design was unraveling. His intricate plan, built on a foundation of terror and greed, was stalling. The nightly raids, once a reliable tool for sowing fear and driving freedmen from their land, had become hesitant, fearful affairs. His men, who had once ridden with the drunken bravado of untouchable gods, were now spooked by their own shadows. The disappearances had poisoned their morale, replacing arrogance with a gnawing paranoia. They were too terrified to ride in anything less than a full company, and even then, they stuck to the main roads, their effectiveness as a tool of intimidation utterly neutered. The whispers of the hunter had become a suffocating presence, more real and more terrifying than any federal marshal. Beaumont, a man accustomed to bending the world to his will through money and influence, found himself stymied by a ghost story. He knew this was no spirit. The efficiency, the silence, the sheer professionalism of the disappearances pointed to something far more dangerous. A man with a particular and lethal set of skills. Pacing the expensive Persian rug in his study, a glass of bourbon sweating in his hand, Beaumont made a decision. His local assets were compromised. He needed an expert, an outsider who was immune to local superstitions and whose only loyalty was to coin. He walked to the telegraph office in town himself, unwilling to trust a messenger with the sensitive contents. He sent a coded message to a contact in New Orleans, a man who specialized in finding solutions to delicate problems. The request was simple: find me a man who can hunt men, and find me the best. The cost is irrelevant. 3 days later, the solution arrived on the afternoon train. His name was Flint. He was the antithesis of Josiah's shadowy form. Where Josiah was a part of the darkness, Flint was a grim, solid presence that seemed to suck the light from the air around him. He was lean and wiry, a man made of sinew and gristle, with a face of sun-baked leather and a pair of cold, calculating eyes the color of a winter sky. He didn't boast or swagger. He moved with a quiet, predatory economy, his gaze constantly sweeping, observing, cataloging. He had made his name during the war, hunting escaped prisoners and deserters for the Confederacy through the swamps of Louisiana and the hills of Tennessee. He was a human bloodhound, and Beaumont had just slipped him the leash. Flint began his hunt not with questions, but with silence. He rode out to the ravine where the last 2 Klansmen had vanished. Beaumont's men had trampled all over the area, obliterating any obvious signs. But Flint was not looking for the obvious. He knelt by the side of the trail, his cold eyes inches from the ground, for a full 10 minutes, as still as a heron waiting for a fish. Then he began to move. He pointed to a single bruised leaf on a low-hanging branch. "Your man was hoisted," he said, his voice a dry rasp, like stones grinding together. "The branch is bruised from the rope, but the leaf is crushed from the weight of a body swinging against it." He walked a few paces and picked up something from the dirt, holding it between his thumb and forefinger. It was a single, almost invisible strand of fiber, hemp rope, good quality, not the cheap stuff you buy at a general store. He moved into the ravine, his eyes scanning the ground, and pointed to a spot where the earth was slightly disturbed. "The other one was taken down here. See the way the branch is broken? It wasn't snapped by a fall. It was broken by a man's boot, a man moving fast and low, driving forward. He spent an hour circling the area, a grim cartographer of violence, reading the story of the attack from signs no one else could even see. That evening, he reported to Beaumont in the same opulent study. He stood before the desk, refusing the offered chair and the glass of bourbon. He was a tool, not a guest. "This isn't a ghost," Flint stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "He's a scout, and a damn good one. Army, I'd wager. Union. By the looks of his work, he knows the land, knows how to use it. He's patient, and he's smart. Beaumont felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. This confirmed his worst fears. Can you find him? Flint's lips pulled back in something that might have been a smile, but it held no warmth. It was the expression of a wolf baring its teeth. He's still a man, and every man leaves a trail. He's been careful, but he's been hunting rabbits. Now he's got a wolf on his scent. I'll find him. Beaumont felt a surge of relief, the master's confidence returning now that he had the right tool for the job. Then find him, he ordered, his voice regaining its familiar tone of command. I don't care what it costs. I want his head on a spike as a warning to any other agitators who think they can challenge me. Flint simply nodded, his cold eyes giving nothing away. The cost will be $500 in gold coin, half now, half when the job is done. And I work alone. The narrative tension in the county shifted. For the first time since he had picked up that scorched rag doll, Josiah Green was not the only hunter in the woods. Flint began closing the distance, his skills a dark mirror of Josiah's own, and the game of cat and mouse had begun in earnest. Flint's investigation, methodical and relentless, inevitably led him to the heart of the freedmen's community, Sarah's general store. It was the hub of communication, the place where news and supplies were traded in equal measure. He entered the store on a bright, hot afternoon, the bell above the door announcing his presence with a cheerful jingle that was utterly at odds with his grim demeanor. Sarah was behind the counter, and Elias was sorting through a crate of tinned goods. Flint's cold eyes swept the room, taking in every detail before they settled on Sarah. I'm looking for information, he said, his voice low. Sheriff says there's been some trouble. Men gone missing. Sarah met his gaze, her face a calm, neutral mask. We hear the whispers, same as everyone, she said, her voice steady. Folks are scared. I'm not interested in whispers, Flint rasped. I'm interested in strangers. Anyone new in town the last few weeks? A man traveling alone, maybe looking for work, maybe just passing through. Elias stepped forward, wiping his hands on his apron. We've had a few drifters, farmhands looking for seasonal work. They come and go. He answered calmly, his preacher's voice soothing and reasonable, betraying none of the frantic fear that was clawing at his insides. He and Sarah had discussed their suspicions about Josiah in hushed tones, their fear for him a constant, unspoken ache. They didn't know for sure that he was the hunter, but they saw the danger Flint represented, a danger aimed directly at the man who was their oldest friend. Flint's gaze shifted between them, sharp and penetrating, searching for any flicker of deception. This man would be different, Flint pressed. Quiet, keeps to himself. A man who knows how to handle himself. Maybe an old soldier. Sarah shook her head, her expression one of polite, regretful ignorance. I can't say I've seen anyone like that, mister. We'd surely remember a man like that. Flint held their gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He bought a plug of tobacco and left, the bell jingling his departure. The moment the door closed, Sarah and Elias exchanged a worried glance. The air in the store suddenly thick and hard to breathe. They had held their ground, but they knew Flint was not a man who gave up easily. That evening, Long after the store was closed and the streets were quiet, Sarah slipped out the back door of the church. In her hands, she carried a small wrapped parcel. She walked to the ancient oak tree at the edge of the churchyard, a place where she and Josiah and Elias had hidden treasures as children, a secret fort known only to them. She knelt and pried up a loose flagstone at the base of the tree. In the small, dark hollow beneath, she placed the parcel. It contained a thick slab of salted pork, a loaf of her dense, dark bread, and a new whetstone for sharpening a blade. It was a silent offering, a prayer against the darkness, an act of faith and desperate hope. She didn't know if he would find it, but she had to do something. She was no longer just a witness to the hunt. She was an accomplice. Josiah discovered Flint's presence not by seeing him, but by reading the woods. He was circling back to check on the root cellar, moving with his usual caution. When he found the sign, it was subtle, something a dozen other men would have walked past without a glance. A single, long strand of horsehair, caught on a thorn bush. It was a pale gray, the color of ash, and it did not belong to his own dark horse. A few yards further on, he found a boot print. It was not the clumsy print of a farmer or a clansman. The heel was deep, the toe light, the stride long and even. It was the print of a man who lived on his feet, a man who knew how to walk in the wilderness. The final clue was the most chilling. On the trunk of a pine tree, almost invisible against the bark, was a small, shallow cut, a sliver of wood carved away with a sharp knife. It was a trail marker, but not one he recognized from his time in the army. It was a private language, the mark of a professional tracker. Josiah stood perfectly still, the sounds of the forest fading away as a cold wave of adrenaline washed over him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, not since the war, when he had been hunted by Confederate patrols in the tangled wilderness of the Virginia Peninsula. It was the icy thrill of a worthy opponent. The hunter was now the hunted. He knew instantly that he could not continue his old patterns. This new man, this wolf, would learn his habits, predict his movements, and set a trap. To continue as he had been was to walk into a cage. He had to change the game. He had to choose the battlefield. His mind raced, sifting through the mental map of the county he had so meticulously built. There was only one place. A place where his mastery of the terrain was absolute. A place where a pursuer's skills would be twisted and turned against him. The Great Cypress Swamp. It was a treacherous, primeval labyrinth of sucking mud, tangled cypress knees, and murky, snake-infested water. It was a place sane men avoided. For Josiah, it was a weapon. He made his decision. He would not run from the wolf. He would invite him into his den. He rode away from the root cellar, but this time, he was not trying to hide his trail. He left a deliberately obvious path. A branch broken here, a patch of mud churned by his horse's hooves there. It was a trail that would be an insult to a novice, but to an expert like Flint, it would be an irresistible, calculated invitation. It was a challenge laid down in the silent language of the hunt, a formal declaration from one predator to another. The game had changed, and Josiah Green was leading his pursuer into the dark heart of the swamp. The invitation was an insult, and Flint knew it. The trail Josiah left was a line drawn in the dirt, a schoolboy's dare, a broken branch here, A carelessly placed hoofprint there. It was a path designed to be found. Arrogance, Flint thought, or desperation. He had hired 2 local guns for support. Brutish men named Harker and Cole, whose primary skills were intimidation and a casual disregard for human life. They saw the trail as a sign of their quarry's incompetence. Flint saw it as the opening move in a chess match where the board itself was the enemy. "He's getting sloppy," Harker grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the damp ground. Flint didn't answer. He simply urged his horse forward, his cold eyes fixed on the path that led directly into the oppressive green maw of the great cypress swamp. The moment they entered, the world changed. The air, already humid, became a thick, suffocating blanket, heavy with the smell of decay, wet earth, and stagnant water. The cheerful sunlight of the open woods was choked off by a dense canopy of cypress and tupelo, leaving only a dim, cathedral-like gloom that played tricks on the eyes. The ground softened, the trail dissolving into a treacherous mire of black mud and tangled roots that writhed like petrified snakes. The drone of insects was a constant, maddening hum, a sound that vibrated in a man's teeth. Flint's horse, a seasoned tracker itself, grew skittish, its ears twitching at the unseen things that slithered and crawled in the murky water that flanked their path. Harker and Cole grew quiet, their earlier bravado seeping away into the sucking mud. This was not their element. This was a primeval world, hostile and alive, and they were intruders. "I don't like this," Cole muttered, his eyes darting nervously into the shadows. "It ain't right in here." Flint's gaze never wavered. He was out of his element, yes, but his focus was absolute. He was a hunter, and a hunter does not fear the wilderness. He respects it. But, as they ventured deeper, a cold knot of unease began to tighten in his own gut. This wasn't just wilderness. It was a fortress, and they had just walked through the gate. Josiah became an extension of the swamp itself. He was the sudden splash in the water just out of sight, the rustle of leaves in a place with no wind, the shadow that flickered at the edge of their vision. He didn't need to hide. He simply needed to let the swamp work on their minds. He led them on a winding, pointless path, doubling back on his own trail, drawing them deeper into the labyrinth. He guided them toward a wide, deceptively solid-looking patch of ground. Flint pulled up short, holding up a hand. He recognized the subtle shimmer on the surface, the lack of vegetation, quicksand. He rasped, though it was more like a deep, clinging mud that could swallow a horse whole. They were forced into a long, frustrating detour, hacking their way through thick curtains of Spanish moss that felt like dead men's hair against their faces. Their confidence, already frayed, was beginning to shred. That's when Josiah took the first piece. He had found the perfect spot, a narrow channel between 2 massive cypress trees, where the path was barely wide enough for a single horse. He had spent an hour weaving a snare from thick, supple vines, anchoring it to a young, powerful sapling he had bent nearly to the ground. As the 3 men rode through in single file, Harker bringing up the rear, Josiah pulled the release rope. The sapling sprang upright with a sound like a giant whip crack. The vine loop, perfectly placed, caught Harker under the arms, yanking him clean out of his saddle. He let out a strangled cry of pure shock as he was hoisted 15 feet into the air, his rifle clattering to the ground. He hung there, spinning slowly, a grotesque pendulum in the green gloom. Cole screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror, and fumbled for his pistol. Flint reacted instantly, his own pistol in his hand, his eyes scanning the canopy. But there was nothing, only their companion, dangling and swearing, and the echoing silence of the swamp. Panic took root. Cole, his face ashen, spurred his horse forward, desperate to put distance between himself and the spot where his companion had been plucked into the sky. He galloped recklessly down the trail, ignoring Flint's sharp command to halt. He rounded a bend and his horse, spooked and running blind, plunged directly into a deep pool of murky black water hidden by a carpet of duckweed. The horse screamed, a terrifying equine sound of panic, as it struggled in the deep water. Cole was thrown clear, landing with a splash in the chest-deep pool. He came up sputtering, his pistol gone, his eyes wild with terror. He abandoned his struggling horse and clawed his way to the bank, scrambling into the woods like a madman, his only thought to escape the suffocating, living trap of the swamp. Flint watched him go, his face a mask of cold fury. He was alone. He dismounted, his rifle held at the ready. The psychological game was over. Now, it was just the hunt. He found Josiah in a small clearing, a rare patch of solid ground surrounded by ancient, gnarled cypress trees whose roots, or knees, jutted from the ground like tombstones. The air was still, the silence absolute. For a long moment, the two hunters simply looked at each other across the 20 yards that separated them. There was no posturing, no words. It was a moment of pure, primal recognition. Two apex predators, alone in their element. Then, the sky opened up, a sudden, torrential downpour, common in the Mississippi autumn, hammered down, soaking them to the skin in seconds. The rain hissed on the leaves and turned the clearing into a slick sheet of mud. Flint raised his rifle and squeezed the trigger. The hammer fell with a useless, metallic click. Wet powder. Josiah didn't even bother to raise his own sharps. He let it fall to the ground. This would not be a battle of rifles. It would be a battle of knives and will. They circled each other, their boots slipping in the mud. The fight, when it came, was not a duel of flashing blades. It was a desperate, ugly brawl. It was grunts and curses, the slick, wet sound of flesh meeting flesh, the frantic scrabbling for purchase in the mud. Flint was strong and wiry, his movements economical and deadly. He lunged, his Bowie knife a blur. Josiah parried with his own heavier blade, the force of the blow jarring his arm to the shoulder. He slipped, and Flint pressed the advantage, a vicious kick catching Josiah in the ribs, sending a bolt of white-hot pain through his side. Josiah rolled with the blow, coming up on one knee, his breath hissing through his teeth. He was wounded, but the pain only fueled the cold, righteous fury that had been simmering inside him for weeks. He was no longer just a man. He was the embodied vengeance of the Carters, the Washingtons, and every other family that had been terrorized by the men Flint served. He saw an opening. As Flint lunged again, aiming for his throat, Josiah didn't meet the blow. Instead, he dropped low, driving his shoulder into Flint's knees. At the same time, he hooked his foot around the gnarled cypress root he had clocked the moment he entered the clearing. The maneuver was pure instinct, a scout's trick, using the terrain as a weapon. Flint, his forward momentum suddenly arrested, his balance gone, crashed backward. His head hit the muddy ground with a sickening thud, and his knife flew from his grasp. Before Flint could even register what had happened, Josiah was on him, a knee pinning his chest, the point of his heavy hunting knife pressed against the soft and vulnerable flesh of his throat. The cold steel was a final, unarguable truth. Flint's eyes, which had held only cold confidence, now showed a flicker of something else, a primal fear. He stared up at the grim, shadowed face looming over him, the rain plastering dark strands of hair to a forehead beaded with sweat and blood. "Do it," Flint gasped, his voice a ragged whisper. "Finish it." Josiah's breath came in ragged bursts, the pain in his side a sharp, insistent fire. He looked down at the man beneath him, the hired killer, the tool of a corrupt and hateful system. Killing him would be easy. It would be just, but it would also be an end. Josiah's purpose was not just to end lives, it was to end a reign of terror. "Death is a mercy," Josiah said, his voice low and strained, barely audible above the drumming of the rain. "You tell Beaumont his time is over. The night belongs to the hunter now." He pressed the knife just enough to draw a single, bright bead of blood, a punctuation mark on his promise. Then he stood up, leaving Flint gasping and broken in the mud. He retrieved his rifle, his movements stiff and pained. He walked over to where Flint's horse stood, nervously tethered. He ignored the horse itself and went straight for the saddlebags. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the elements, was a leather-bound ledger. Josiah opened it. His eyes, accustomed to the dim light, scanned the pages. It was all there, page after page of meticulous, damning evidence. Names, dates, and sums of money paid out to Klan members for services rendered, and on other pages, a neat accounting of land parcels, their owners, and the dates their deeds were expected to revert to the county, with August Beaumont's name noted as the intended buyer. It was the conspiracy, laid bare in cold, hard ink. It was the final piece of evidence he needed, the weapon that could dismantle Beaumont's empire of greed and hate from the inside out. He tucked the ledger securely inside his own coat, a weight against his wounded side that felt more like a victory than any single act of violence ever could. He had won the battle, but this book, was how he would win the war. Flint did not ride back into Natchez. He stumbled, a ghost of a man, caked in mud, his clothes in tatters. He led his exhausted horse by the reins, his steps a shuffling, painful gait. He was a living testament to the swamp's victory, a message carved in flesh and humiliation. He went directly to Beaumont's estate, leaving a trail of mud on the pristine marble of the entryway. He didn't wait to be announced. He walked straight into the study where Beaumont was pouring a morning brandy, his hand shaking slightly. Beaumont looked up, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly curdled into fury at the sight of the tracker's failure. "What is the meaning of this?" Beaumont demanded, his voice tight with rage. "Where is he?" Flint just looked at him, his cold eyes, for the first time, holding a flicker of something akin to fear, or perhaps a deep, soul-shaking respect for the thing that had broken him. "The hunt is over," Flint rasped, his voice a dry, cracked whisper. "Your man, he is not a man. He is the swamp. He is the night. You cannot kill him." He turned without another word and shuffled out of the mansion, leaving a stunned and silent August Beaumont in his wake. The tracker collected his remaining fee from a terrified clerk in town and was gone on the noon train. A specter vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. The collapse was not a storm. It was a rot that spread from the inside out. With Flint gone and the story of his defeat spreading like wildfire through the clan's ranks, the last vestiges of their courage evaporated. The two men Josiah had left in the swamp, Harker and Cole, eventually found their way out, babbling stories of a phantom who commanded the trees and the water, a hunter who plucked men from their saddles and sent them to a watery grave. The men Josiah held captive in the root cellar were a silent, terrifying mystery. 6 of their best, most brutal enforcers had vanished into thin air. Beaumont's authority, built on fear, was useless against a greater fear. His orders to ride were met with sullen silence and averted eyes. No one would patrol the back roads. No one would venture into the woods after dark. His reign of terror had ended. A fragile, uncertain peace began to settle over the countryside. For the first time in months, the nights were silent, broken only by the familiar chorus of crickets and frogs. Not the thunder of hoofbeats and the crackle of flames. People began to breathe again. A shallow, tentative breath at first, then deeper, as one silent night followed another. The absence of fear was a strange and holy thing. Josiah made his way back from the swamp under the cover of darkness, the ledger a hard, rectangular weight against his wounded side. Every step was a fresh agony, the pain in his ribs a sharp, stabbing reminder of his brutal fight with Flint. He moved slowly, his body screaming in protest, but his mind was clear, focused on the final move of the game. He didn't go to his small, hidden camp. He went to the one place that had always been a sanctuary, Elias's church. He slipped through the back door, a shadow in the pre-dawn gloom of the vestry. Elias and Sarah were already there, their faces etched with worry. They had been keeping a vigil for days, their prayers a silent, desperate plea sent into the darkness. They saw him, wounded, covered in mud and blood, leaning heavily against the doorframe, and their hearts seized. Sarah let out a small, choked gasp, rushing forward to help him into a chair. "Josiah, you're hurt," she whispered, her hands hovering over his wounds, afraid to touch him. Elias was right behind her, his face a mixture of terror and relief. "It was you," Elias said, his voice a low, awed whisper. "It wasn't a question. It was always you, wasn't it?" Josiah didn't answer the question directly. He reached into his coat, his movements slow and pained, and pulled out the oilcloth-wrapped ledger. He placed it on the small table between them. The sound it made in the quiet room was as loud and final as a gavel strike. "It had to be done," Josiah said, his voice strained. He unwrapped the book and opened it. In the dim light of a single lamp, they saw the neat columns, the names, the dates, the damning figures. Sarah's eyes widened in shock as she read the names of men she had known her whole life. Men who sat in the pews of this very church on Sundays, their piety a grotesque mask for their nightly evils. Elias stared at the pages, his face pale, the full horrifying scope of the conspiracy settling upon him like a shroud. "This is Beaumont's entire operation," he breathed, tracing a finger over a line item detailing a payment for the burning of the Carter's farm. Josiah nodded, a grim look on his face. "Get this to the federal marshal in Vicksburg," he said, his voice firm despite the pain. "Don't trust anyone here. Not Sheriff Jones. Not anyone. It's the only way to make it stick." the only way to burn out the rot for good. Elias looked from the book to Josiah's determined, pain-filled eyes. The preacher, the man of peace, felt a new and unfamiliar fire kindle in his own soul. This was his fight now, too. Using his connections with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a network that operated as its own secret railroad of information and aid, Elias traveled to Vicksburg. He wasn't just a small-town preacher on an errand. He was a messenger carrying a declaration of war, protected by a chain of trusted hands. 2 weeks later, the reckoning arrived in Natchez. It came not as a whisper, but as a troop of hard-faced United States Marshals, their horses kicking up dust on the main street, their rifles held with a casual authority that made the local law look like children playing dress-up. They rode directly to August Beaumont's plantation. They found him on his veranda, overseeing his accounts. The picture of genteel power. They arrested him in full view of his field hands and house staff, the cold iron of the handcuffs a shocking and final desecration of his authority. The news spread through Natchez like a shockwave. Beaumont and a dozen other prominent citizens, their names taken directly from the ledger, were arrested. Their conspiracy, their greedy, murderous land grab, was exposed to the world. The federal investigation, backed by the undeniable proof in Beaumont's own hand, was swift and decisive. The land grab was officially thwarted, the stolen deeds declared void, the promise of ownership restored to the families who had been terrorized. Josiah's work was done. He had not only stopped the violence, he had dismantled the corrupt system that fueled it. He had brought the truth to light. He rested for a few days in the secret root cellar, his wounds tended to by Sarah, who brought him food and medicine in the dead of night. Their shared secret a silent, powerful bond. When his strength returned, he knew it was time to leave. He was seen one last time, from a distance, by Sarah. She had woken just before dawn, a sense of unease pulling her from her bed. She walked to the window of her small room above the store and looked out toward the high ridge that overlooked the town. And there he was, a lone rider on a dark horse, a silhouette against the pale, blushing sky of the new day. He was looking down, not at the town, but at the now peaceful fields and farms that stretched out below, the homes of the people he had protected. As she watched, the thick morning fog, a feature of life so close to the great river, began to roll in from the Mississippi. It came in a soft, silent, white wave, swallowing the landscape, muffling the world in its embrace. His silhouette seemed to waver, to soften, the hard edges of the man and his horse blurring into the encroaching mist. Sarah held her breath, her hand pressed against the cool glass of the window. He was there one moment, a solid, dark promise on the horizon, and the next, when the fog was at its thickest, he was simply gone. He had vanished into the white embrace of the morning, as if the land itself had reclaimed its guardian. Later that morning, the air was filled with a sound that had been absent for too long, the pure, untroubled laughter of children. The Carter girl, her 2 younger brothers, and a few friends were playing near the riverbank, their fears forgotten, their world once again a place of sunshine and games. Their laughter echoed in the quiet air, a testament to the peace that had been so dearly bought. As they chased a frog near a cluster of large, flat rocks at the water's edge, the girls stopped. Something was sitting on the largest rock, a place where they often skipped stones. It was a brass lantern, She approached it cautiously, her friends gathering behind her. The lantern was clean, its brass polished to a soft gleam, as if it had been placed there only moments ago. But it was the flame that held them mesmerized. Inside the clean glass, a single, steady flame burned with a clear, unwavering light. A gentle breeze was coming off the river, rustling the leaves on the trees and stirring the children's hair. But the flame did not flicker. It did not dance or waver. It burned with an impossible, resolute stillness, a small, defiant point of light that held its ground against the wind. The children gathered around it, their faces lit by its warm, steady glow, their laughter replaced by a sense of silent, childish awe. The story of Josiah Green was never officially written down in any history book. He became a myth, a whisper in the dark for those who would do evil, and a symbol of hope for those he had protected. Over time, the stark white chalk marks he had left on the trees faded, washed away by the rain and bleached by the sun, until they were only memories. But the story of the hunter of Natchez, the silent rider with the steady lantern, was carved into the very soul of the community, a tale passed down from one generation to the next around hearth fires and on church steps. It was a story of a man who came home seeking peace, but was forced to become a warrior to create it for others. Josiah Green vanished from the world of men, a ghost who had completed his task and returned to the shadows. But he left his light behind, sitting on a rock by the river, a silent promise, a testament to the fact that even in the deepest, most suffocating darkness, a single, steady flame of courage can burn forever against the wind.